Now, speaking against the motion, Bill Kristol.
Thank you, Robert. Let me begin by thanking Bob Rosencrantz for bringing Intelligence Squared to New York and to the United States. I don't know if Intelligence Squared has a slogan or a motto in London, but over here you might want to think about fair and balanced. We debate, you decide. You might almost call this a no-spin zone here, you know, with Robert Siegel as Bill O'Reilly. I shouldn't have said that. This will ruin his career on NPR, and I'll never be invited back to All Things Considered. So, I personally came in undecided, as many of you did, and even leaning slightly to the other side. But I've been convinced by Ruel and Patrick's brilliant arguments that Bob said he wanted intellectually respectable positions on both sides, and I have a high opinion of George and Sanam and Karim, but I've got to say that, unfortunately, they're intelligent people, but the arguments aren't, well, I guess they're respectable, but not convincing. I was put off by Karim's false praise of me for a second, and I salute Sanam for her genuine concern, obviously, for the Iranian people, who I think we all agree deserve a much better regime than they have, and I think we all agree, we haven't talked about this, deserve much more aggressive efforts on the part of the United States and other democracies, and Europe could do much more here to help them liberate themselves from this regime. George is one of the more reasonable Democrats in Washington. I'd known him for a while, and he worked for Senator Biden, and so I know that to be a fact, but it was the tip-off for all of you was when he said that he didn't believe we should kill ourselves. That was...
I thought that was the right position.
That was a courageous break from the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and I want to pay tribute to George. I'm doing my best to ruin all these people's careers. I'm doing my best to ruin all of their careers. Look, we should not tolerate a nuclear Iran. Three quick reasons, and a couple of them have been touched on, but maybe not developed. George says, and I think everyone probably agrees, that we have to be tougher in our diplomacy, think of more seriously about sanctions, move perhaps outside the Security Council to get sanctions if we can, explore financial pressure to really squeeze Iran, which I think the administration is beginning to do. Secretary of the Treasury Paulson is working pretty seriously on this. That will be done, I think, outside the Security Council and through a sort of coalition of the willing on the finance ministry side. None of this, and this is all good, none of this will work unless it's backed up by the threat of force. Diplomacy will only work if there is a real threat of force, not just saying options are on the table, but a sense that we really won't tolerate the outcome if Iran does not yield, if the moderates, to the degree there are some in the Iranian regime, aren't empowered by the pressure we're putting on to prevent the headlong rush to nuclear weapons and manage to change course domestically. Diplomacy can't work without the threat of force. Therefore, it really would be disastrous to diplomacy to say we must tolerate a nuclear Iran. So whatever people might think one would have to do, and sometimes one has to do things in the real world 7 or 10 years from now, or 3 years from now, I suppose, we should not say we should tolerate a nuclear Iran, and therefore you should all vote no, just to help diplomacy along. But I'm serious about that, and I'm serious that I believe we shouldn't, at the end of the, I will satisfy Karim and say that I would bomb Iran in a pinch, but I really, it is important to not even to signal weakness. The only reason the Europeans got serious in 2003 is that we went into Iraq, that we hadn't yet encountered the difficulties we've encountered in the subsequent 3 years, and the Iranians were worried, and the Europeans were worried that Bush really would use force, and that's what made the Europeans much tougher than it looked as if they would have been prior to 2003. So for diplomacy to work, you need the credible threat of force. You therefore cannot say that we would tolerate, or certainly not that we must tolerate, a nuclear Iran. Second point, so for diplomacy to work, you need the threat of force. Second, and the credible and real threat of force, so real plans, real attempt to lay the groundwork for it if it comes to that. Secondly, deterrence. I mean, that is the ultimate argument. Obviously, on the other side, we can deter Iran, we deter the Soviet Union, we deter China, Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons, and so far at least haven't used them. That depends on the nature of the regime. Is this the Brezhnev regime, so to speak, conservative, cautious, old men, as George said, or is this a much more radical regime, or at least a regime with radical elements in it, and do we have confidence that the radical elements won't prevail internally? I don't think so. This is a rising, confident, ambitious, aggressive regime, thinks it's carrying forth a historic mission, sort of a jihadist mission on behalf of Islam in general, particularly on behalf of Shia Islam, but perfectly willing to work with Sunni jihadists and also to compete with Sunni jihadists in radicalism, which is itself very dangerous. And of course, that's the story in some respects of the last 25 years in the Middle East, with the Wahhabis and the Iranians competing to radicalize Islam and unfortunately succeeding. Letting Iran progress towards nuclear weapons just increases the strength of all the worst radicalizing forces, the jihadist forces within Islam. And it would be disastrous, in my opinion. It's not just disastrous for Iran to get nuclear weapons. It's disastrous for them to succeed in progressing towards nuclear weapons over the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years. Because every month that we huff and puff, and the Europeans huff and puff, and we put off another Security Council resolution, and they progress, and Ahmadinejad comes here and is treated well by the Council of Foreign Relations.
2 minutes.
And pays no price for anything he says or anything he does. Every month and every year that happens, the worst forces in the Middle East are strengthened. Every government that's teetering and isn't sure which side to join, basically, our side, or the moderate side, or the radical side, decides they have to cut a deal with the radical side. Individuals decide that looks like the way of the future. This is the classic dangerous scenario. If one hopes that the Iranian people and more moderate forces in the Iranian regime are going to prevail, the only way to help them to prevail is not to reward Ahmadinejad. And that is what we are now doing by holding open the possibility that we would tolerate a nuclear Iran. So it's not just that it would be terrible if they got nuclear weapons. And I think, incidentally, it's not just tolerating nuclear Iran, it's tolerating a nuclear Egypt and a nuclear Saudi Arabia, and then a whole bunch of nuclear countries, which itself creates a very dangerous world. It is also the process of getting towards a nuclear Iran is itself extremely dangerous. That is, I don't like to use models of the 30s or the analogy of the 30s or Hitler, but in this respect, it is like the 30s. Throughout Hitler's success at each stage strengthened him internally. He didn't start out in firm control of the regime of which he was chancellor. There were others who thought he was reckless. Every time he did something reckless and got away with it, it discredited his internal critics. It empowered fascists elsewhere in Europe, and other regimes began moving in that direction. The democracies became demoralized. We ended up fighting a war against a much more powerful fascist alliance axis than would have been the case if we had acted much earlier. We face that prospect, unfortunately, if we let a jihadist, radical regime successfully pursue nuclear weapons in the Middle East today.